Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the podcast, and Hunter is joining me on the podcast today. Hunter, thanks for being here.
Autumn, it is great to be here, and I'm glad that we finally get to discuss a subject upon which you are a longtime student and expert, Middle East peace and war.
Yes, that's not quite true. That will shock no one to hear that introductory statement and then hear me say, We are going to discuss the conflict in Israel today, but we want to do so as fellow learners, and we want to ask together as we process some of the realities of what's going on in Israel and the Israeli Hamas conflict that's playing out near the Gaza Strip at the moment. We want to ask, how do we think about this with a biblical lens? How do we do it in a way that maintains the dignity of the people involved? So that's what we're going to do. I am not even close to an expert. Are you?
I'm not either. And one of my hobbies is keeping up with international relations. Maybe in a different form of my life, I would have gone to school for international relations. So I really enjoy studying international relations, and just the strategic back and forth is fascinating to me. And yet it's a hobby, and it's a hobby that I dabble in. It's like fishing or cycling. You know, I'm not good at it, and I'm not an expert. So I thought, though, it would be important for us to discuss this with our listeners, some of whom may be far better versed in these things than we are. But I thought it'd be good for us to discuss this for the sake of our listeners, because it seems to me that we might be moving into a era of history, you might say, where global conflict and conflict involving our own society, the United States, is going to be more common and more frequent. And I think as Christians, we're going to be pressed to think morally and think biblically and think as Christians about questions that some of us may not have ever had to face in our lives, or maybe have not had to think about as hard as we're going to have to think about them in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. The way we chose to go about this today is that you and I have been reading in an attempt to both keep up on the situation as it's unfolding and to seek understanding. And so we have compiled a few articles that we thought were helpful in this exercise, in the exercise of seeking understanding and learning. And we're going to share some themes that we've pulled out of those articles, and we'll link to the articles as well.
I find that the more I read on this subject, the more multifaceted my thoughts become. And so we offer these articles as a place for our listeners, if they want to begin studying this and thinking about it, or perhaps add to what they're already reading, to go and look at and to add to their reading. And then if they have things that they've studied that have been helpful to them, please share them with us. In fact, I've had numerous conversations over the last couple of weeks on this, and different people have shared different things with me that's been really, really helpful to go and read and look at, some of which I've been able to do, and some are still on my list. But we offer this in the spirit of friends who are sharing what we're learning and what we're reading and what we're thinking about.
Mm-hmm. One thing you said a moment ago, Hunter, is something that I've been mulling over in the past week, and that is that we might need to think more deeply. Especially we being 30, 40, early 50s year olds Americans who haven't experienced the world in a state of division and potential conflict such as it is now, and appears to be maybe moving into an era in which that is more intense. And so the we I'm referring to is those of us kind of in that situation.
And I want to go on record as saying I'm not yet in my early 50s.
So that wasn't an implication of your age.
But if you are Gen X, if you are Gen Z, if you're millennial, I realize I didn't get those in the right order. But if you are 20s, 30s, 40s, you probably have not had to think about global conflict, world war, in a way that our parents and their parents' generation did. We just haven't lived through anything like that. And because of what's happening in the world now with the emergence of a belligerent Russia, a very aggressive China, and Iran that is committed to eradicating Israel and is using all kinds of surrogates to try to put pressure on that. And then the way these different powers tend to work together, the world we live in is very unstable in a way that it hasn't been in my lifetime. And I might be pressed in the next half of my life to think about world conflict, global wars in a way that I haven't had to before. And I take it that many of our listeners are in the same boat. So we'll just do a little bit of that this morning.
We will. And one thing that this has exposed, this conflict particularly has exposed within the discussion in an American context, is that we being you and I here on the Vision for Life podcast, talk about dominant cultural narratives and the implications for us as individuals or even for our Christian community. We rarely talk about them with the perspective that these dominant cultural narratives actually have some political power and sway. And so that is something that's uniquely different in this type of a conversation. Well, we've constructed today's conversation around 3 themes. So let's start with the first. Theme 1 is the need and possibility of moral clarity.
Yeah, moral clarity is the idea that we can sometimes say with a lot of confidence and clarity, this is what's good and this is what's evil. And particularly to name evil as evil. And I think this is a helpful place to start. And in just a minute, I'll mention why this is a helpful place to start. This actually came in one of the articles we read. But we might say the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict is complex, and it goes as far back in history as you want to go. In the modern era, it really probably began in 1917. So there's a lot of history to be understood there and to be studied, and a lot of back and forth, and even the modern events and politics of it are complex. So that's true, and we need to be able to say this with clarity. The October 7th attacks of Hamas on Israel were evil, and they were evil, and you have to start with that. These terroristic attacks and atrocities were absolutely evil. And as we'll see in a minute, some have not been able to say that with clarity. And I tend to not trust voices who can't speak with moral clarity when there's obvious evil happening. And so as Christians, we can just start there. And a couple of articles that we read have really, I think, made the case very well. There was an article at the Gospel Coalition written by Bernard Howard and Ivan Mesa. Ivan Mesa is an editor I've worked with at the Gospel Coalition in the past, really sharp guy. And it was titled Israel's 9/11, The Need for Moral Clarity, kind of comparing the attack they endured in its gravity and how it impacted their society and the evil of it, similar to how Americans would have experienced 9/11. Russell Moore wrote an article at Christianity Today called Both Sidisms about Hamas is a moral failure. Both side-ism, not isms, both side-ism.
Both side-ism.
About Hamas is a moral failure.
I think one thing you're pointing out, Hunter, in our need for clarity in this moment, and that these articles also focus on, is not even the fact that Hamas, this, of course, is important in this equation, but in this situation, but not even the fact that this was carried out by this organization. It was the nature of what was done and the way in which this attack was carried out and the types of acts against people that we saw take place that have become evident since October 7th. And so our ability to say this is evil is looking at those actions themselves and in clear consideration of what was done. And I think that clarity would extend to any situation, regardless of the actor, regardless of the perpetrator.
Let me give you a quote from the Gospel Coalition article by Bernard Howard and Ivan Mesa that I think summarizes this really well. They write, "We accept that the state of Israel hasn't always acted blamelessly in its conduct toward the Palestinian people. To be pro-Israel in this situation, as we the authors are, isn't to whitewash every action Israel's government or military have taken from its founding to today. We see the frustration, pain, and grief experienced by Palestinians, and we want to take seriously the Bible's command to weep with those who weep, which includes Palestinians mourning their dead, both past and present. But the inevitable existence of wrongdoing on both sides doesn't always produce a moral fog. Sometimes the fog lifts. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for instance, can be condemned by Christians without hesitation. Hamas's attack on Israel is a similarly clear example of wrongdoing that can be firmly condemned without equivocation. I think that says it really succinctly and clearly. And then in his article, Russell Moore goes on to make the point that the both sides kind of thinking is helpful in some dimensions, but not in other dimensions. And he does a really good job of distinguishing when we should use both sides kind of logic and when we should use more of this binary logic that to say, Hamas's attack is evil. And so I would commend his article for that reason to our listeners. And here's a snapshot of what he says. There are several senses in which an appeal to both sides of the reality here are completely right. For one, both sides, all sides, are human beings created in the image of God. We ought to care about the lives and deaths of Israelis and of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, or anywhere else. And Israeli life is of no more value in the eyes of God than a Palestinian life, and vice versa. Both sides also refers rightly to who is harmed by this atrocity and the inevitable war to follow. Hamas is killing and destroying the futures of both Israelis and of Palestinians. That's one of the reasons we shouldn't think of this as a war between Israel and, quote, the Palestinians, but exactly as Israel defined it, a war on Hamas in response to a vicious and unprecedented attack. I like the work he's doing there to distinguish Hamas from all Palestinians. Both sides is also perfectly appropriate when it comes to working for and hoping for a better future for both Israel and the Palestinians. That rules out the unthinking acceptance of anything the modern state of Israel does. God certainly doesn't accept everything, even biblical Israel did. And it rules out chanting from the river to the sea in Times Square, just as it rules out any viewpoint or program that would see Israel completely eradicated. We want both sides, here referring to Israelis and Palestinians, not to Hamas, to thrive and coexist. All of that is far different from the kind of both sides language that has been used in some conversations about the morality of the Hamas attacks. Now, what he's getting at here is we can have biblical justice and human flourishing hopes for Israelis and Palestinians, and we can, even in the history of this long conflict, we can see wrongdoing on both sides, and yet some people have referenced the wrongdoing historically that's happened on both sides as a way of saying, well, you can't really blame Hamas for these attacks, or some have even gone so far as to say, well, Israel is actually really to blame for these attacks because they've done this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and that led us to where we are today. So kind of they got what was coming to them, and that kind of moral reasoning fails to deal with just the atrocity and the evil that took place.
Mm-hmm. We've seen, as we'll discuss more in a moment, the way that this conflict has revealed some of this inability on the part of certain set of the progressive left to condemn these acts, the actual actions carried out against Israelis who were civilians, to actually condemn those. I think that the type of thinking that Russell Moore is describing and the nuance that he includes, the way in which as Christians, we are called to recognize the impact on both Palestinians and Israelis, and we can still have the clarity to condemn what Hamas did and to condemn those sorts of actions anytime. I think there can be a temptation within other certain Christian spaces to completely condemn all Palestinians or to let them get muddied up in this conflict as a part of what Hamas has done as well. So I appreciate the way that he set the groundwork in that article to help us think through as a call to anyone with a tendency to make it overly black and white. There's a part of this that, as you said, is absolutely binary and that we need to recognize directly. And there's much of it, too, in which we can think about in terms of the human dignity granted to all people. And the way he defines that is that God cares deeply about both a Palestinian life and an Israeli life.
For a long time, Western nations have been working for what's often called a two-state solution to the land dispute there, and that would be there's a Jewish state and there's a Palestinian state. And I think that can be driven sometimes by the motivations Moore is talking about. We want both groups of people to be able to live peaceably together, to flourish and to live at peace. And that's even our biblical understanding of the world would desire that for them as image bearers of God. And so you can be committed to a two-state solution, to the peaceable existence of Israelis and Palestinians, and yet still say these attacks that Hamas committed were evil. Mm. And I appreciate that Russell Moore brought out, obviously they were an evil committed and perpetrated against Jewish people. There is also a sense in which the Palestinian people are hurt tremendously by the actions of Hamas, and it is their evil attack that has set this whole unfortunate chain of events in motion.
There's one more quote that you mentioned from this article that I think is really helpful, Hunter, that brings some clarity to this discussion as well, and that's how to know, essentially. He includes a sort of litmus test to ask yourself, am I considering this within the framework that Scripture gives us, or am I simply listening to voices on one side or the other that align with my sentiments? Mm-hmm. So he says, a way to examine our own consciences. Will you read that for us?
This is one of the quickest ways to recognize if you have outsourced your conscience to some ideology or sect. If your first response to seeing obvious immorality or injustice is some version of, well, obviously that's bad and no one supports it, but do you know what the victims did? Then you are in a morally dangerous place. That way lies hackery. That's Russell Moore. In the TGC article, Ivan Mesa and Howard made the point also that who has moral clarity on this helps you know who to trust. You shouldn't trust a voice that can't be clear on this. And so if you were to hear a voice kind of reasoning in the way that Moore just described, and there have been some, we'll cite some examples here in a minute, those are people who have really lost their moral framework. There's something off in the way they are viewing reality and viewing the world and calling balls and strikes that should make you hesitant to trust them as reliable sources.
All right, so this is the first theme, the need for moral clarity in this moment. And then what is the second theme?
Well, it's related, and that is the left side of the American political cultural landscape has particularly had a difficult time consistently addressing this. And we've seen a fracturing in the left over this question. Some on the left have moral clarity about this, and some seem not to have moral clarity about this. In fact, there have even been what might be considered some far left groups that in the wake of the attacks, they celebrated them as good for the Palestinian people in a way that made others, not only on the right and in the mainstream of American culture, but even on the left, made others who had moral clarity really, really upset. We might frame it up like this. In the last 10 years, we have seen forces and groups and ideologies on both extremes, right and left of our culture. It might be called they wouldn't even be called conservative and liberal necessarily. They are just the far right and the far left that that have been clearly evil. Like we saw in 2016 forward, we saw a rise of both anti-Semitism and some white supremacist ideology happening on the far right of American culture. And it was really important for people who sit on the right side of American culture and politics. It was really important for them to be able to say, that's wrong. That's not us. That's wrong. We don't endorse that ideology. If they couldn't say that with clarity, then you shouldn't continue to trust them as reasonable moral voices. In the same way, the same thing is now happening on the left, particularly as it relates to the Jewish people and to Israel and to this attack. There was an article in The Atlantic that you found and sent to me that I think is really helpfully describes this. It was by Helen Lewis, and the title is "The Progressives Who Flunked the Hamas Test." Now, to set the context, Helen Lewis would be on the pretty far left of American culture and politics. She's an advocate of what she calls the original conception of intersectionality, which is a legal doctrine advanced by the American critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And she's trying to say, even though she has advocated for that as a way to understand particularly race law and race history and legal and in America, even though she's advocated for that, she is troubled by the way she's seen some of this intersectional ideas being used now on kind of the far social justice left.
Here's a quote from that article by Helen Lewis. In corners of academia and social justice activism, where the identity of the oppressor and the oppressed are never in doubt, many people failed that test. In response to a fellow progressive who argued that targeting civilians is always wrong, the Yale professor Zarina Grewal replied, "Settlers are not civilians. This is not hard." Parenthesis. She has since locked her X account. End parenthesis. Chicago's Black Lives Matter chapter posted a picture of a paraglider referencing the gunman who descended on civilians at a music festival near the Gaza border from the air. The chapter said in a statement that we aren't proud of the post, which was later deleted. Harvard student groups posted a letter stating that its signatories hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. Several of the named groups have since withdrawn their endorsement. The New York branch of the Democratic Socialists of America promoted a rally where protesters chanted, "Resistance is justified when people are occupied," and one participant displayed a swastika. These actions prompted criticism by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, perhaps the DSA's most prominent figure, and the resignation of members, including the comedian Sarah Silverman. In a statement, the New York City Democratic Socialists regretted the, quote, confusion that its rhetoric had caused, but added, "We are also concerned that some have chosen to focus on a rally while ignoring the root causes of violence in the region, the far-right Netanyahu government's escalating human rights violations and explicitly genocidal rhetoric, and the dehumanization of the Palestinian people."
What we have right there is a kind of the both-sidism that Russell Moore was really warning us against. He's what he said. If your first response to seeing obvious immorality or injustice is some version of, well, obviously that's bad and no one supports it, but do you know what the victims did? And what is happening by some on the left is they want to essentially, in their scheme, they want to call Jewish people colonizers. And because of that, they're actually not even denouncing it in some cases. They are celebrating it. As the Chicago Black Lives Matter chapter posted a picture of a paraglider, and the sail was like the Palestinian flag. And they were just celebrating that. You also hear that in this New York City Democratic Socialist quote. We are also concerned that some have chosen to focus on a rally while ignoring the root causes of violence in the region, the far-right Netanyahu government's escalating human rights violations and explicitly genocidal rhetoric, and the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. That would then just shift all of the blame for the attacks onto Israel. It's important to say the victims of these attacks were Jewish civilians, those were the victims. And the perpetrators of the attacks were the Gaza military, paramilitary attackers. And that's obvious. Now, as previous articles have said, it's important to understand the history, and it's important to want peace and justice for both groups of people. And yet you never get peace and justice by tolerating injustice and evil. That is the toleration of injustice and evil as a way to achieve some better society or better justice. That has a deep history in human thought. That kind of thinking has a deep history in human thought. It is the exact kind of thinking that led to the Holocaust. It has a deep kind of thinking in human thought, or deep history in human thought, and it's always evil. Mm-hmm. We've seen this in our own nation's reckoning. We've had to reckon with evil that American settlers perpetuated against Native Americans. It's not wrong to reckon with that. We have to reckon with that. If we just say, well, they were achieving some manifest destiny, look at this great society that's come out of that, so we just kind of justify it. Part of being human and living in a fallen world is just being able to acknowledge good and evil, and especially to acknowledge call what is evil evil. We see that in our own city's history with the Sand Creek Massacre. Mm-hmm. We have to be able. That's part of us being a functioning society today, is being able to say that's wrong, and we're now seeing an inability of some on the American left to do that, and that's pretty concerning.
Yeah, this idea that certain forms of achievement, as it were, within that framework, certain forms of advancing an idea, a political persuasion, or even a regime change are acceptable is deeply embedded in human history. History is rife with examples, but it takes a very particular form in the critical theory that has been adopted by many on the progressive left, in that if you deem a group of people oppressed, then any form of resistance can be justified, and that has obvious flaws and faults. And that's why Helen Lewis is pointing out that there are certain within that ideology who adopt that notion that then were unable to say, when something very clearly morally wrong and evil happened, that it was wrong because it was done by a quote-unquote oppressed group of people, even though Hamas cannot fit neatly into that box.
That's right. We're talking about this, and I wanted to spend some time on it because we probably have listeners who spend a lot of time in academic kind of spaces, and this is particularly prevalent in academic spaces, university settings, here in our own city. Like you would see some of this thinking probably at universities, like University of Denver. You might see some of this kind of thinking in prominent academic spaces here in our own state and close to us. And so, if you travel in legal circles or academic circles, it is likely that you are having to grapple with this kind of post-colonial kind of social justice theory. And this is a moment for you to see that it's got some significant flaws to it. And as a Christian, you should be careful not to be co-opted by that and just to outsource your moral thinking to it.
There's two things within this that you've mentioned that we need to heed. One is the real reckoning of the past and evil that has been done and is being done. And the other point that you're bringing out, H, is that within progressivism, many of these ideologies that they've adopted are an insufficient framework to provide a way forward. So the real reckoning that needs to be done in ourselves, in our society, with evil in the past, that is true. We can heed that. And yet there's a particular way forward, one of these being resistance, that we can't approve of within a biblical framework.
That's right. One of the thoughts I'm having right here as we're thinking about this, and so it would probably be better developed if I had more time to chew on it. But in this kind of oppressor-oppressed binary, and this kind of theory that really always justifies regime change, or like in the Holocaust, it was used to justify eradicating Jews because we're going to achieve some better society. One of the overarching kind of themes is it cannot acknowledge its own injustices and blind spots. And whereas the traditional liberal Western understanding of justice that our society was built on, and I mean liberal in the classical sense, not in the left of the American spectrum, but in the committed to the ideals of liberty and justice for all, kind of the founding ideals of America and the Western world. One of the strengths of that way of thinking is it can acknowledge even the injustices that were committed in its own society. So I gave an example a minute ago from our city's own history, the Sand Creek massacre of Native Americans by some of the early powers in Denver. And within a Western liberal society, we do have the capacity to look at that, to acknowledge that that was evil, to repent of it, because repentance comes from our Christian heritage, to repent of it, and to commit to living more justly, and even to doing what needs to be done to repair damages for that evil. So that's the kind of thinking that a Western liberal society will do. And so annually in our city, we remember the evil of the Sand Creek massacre. In this other way of thinking, this oppressed oppressor binary, there's never any acknowledgement of evil on your side, and that is a dangerous place to be. Mm-hmm. And so I've actually talked in the last week or so with people who I think are kind of stuck in that binary, and they're having real trouble acknowledging just the evil that was perpetuated, and they're wanting to go back to injustice that's been done historically against the Palestinians, which there may be some insight there, but that's preventing them from empathizing and just speaking clearly about the evil that was done.
Within Helen Lewis's article, as she's pointing out these examples of the way in which the progressive left has responded, and as she says, this exposes some of the inability of their ideology to deal with the moral evil that has happened and to call it clearly what it is. There's another interesting aspect attached to that many articles have mentioned as well, and you included a mention of it here because it's an interesting dynamic in American society even, and that is that many Jewish people in America actually have aligned themselves with that ideology politically, and now many are speaking out. We listed one article here that we'll share in the notes to today's episode as well, but many have mentioned how they feel really abandoned by the people who had been their political allies.
Here's a headline from the New York Times on October 20th. On Israel, progressive Jews feel abandoned by their left-wing allies. And then the little subheading of the article said, Jewish leaders and voters said they were taken aback to discover that many of their ideological allies saw them as oppressors who deserved blame following the Israel attacks. So what they're seeing here is on the American left, some are committed to adjudicating justice claims through the classical Western liberal framework of human rights, and some are now shifted to adjudicating justice claims through the critical kind of almost Marxist theory of oppressed or oppressor. And those are two different ways of looking at the world, and they may have some common cause, but that's going to fracture, and we're seeing that happen in our own society. And kind of what I'm commending to Christians is, I think the classical Western liberal way of adjudicating justice claims sits much closer to the biblical worldview. It's not exactly parallel maybe to it, but it sits much closer to the biblical worldview than the critical theory way of adjudicating these claims does. And so just issuing a sober warning, I think, for us to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. I think perhaps so many of the Jewish American immigrants had fallen into that dichotomy, oppressed and oppressor, because the Western world largely assumed that the Jewish people fit neatly into that oppressed box after World War II. And so the support of the Western world largely was behind the Jewish peoples. And so at some point between then and the creation of the state of Israel, the modern land area that is now marked out as the state of Israel, sometime between then, when the sentiment said Jewish people fit into this oppressed category, and now in a Western world much more heavily influenced by these critical theory categories and much less attuned to the classic, as you said, Western way, the older classical Western way of navigating these types of conflicts, and even the ideology that supported the way that that was navigated. Now, Israel is assumed instead within that same framework that they had found to be powerful before. They're now listed or slated as oppressors.
And Helen Lewis brings that out in her article. She brings out that it's hard to fit this conflict into the intersectional framework. She points out it's the Jewish citizens of the modern state of Israel are historically oppressed. They are the survivors of an attempt to wipe them out completely, and that state currently has a lot of power in that part of the world. So you can't fit them neatly into a binary, and it's just hard to adjudicate these claims with what she calls the simplistic logic of pop intersectionality. And she said that as someone who has appreciated that legal theory in understanding American historic race relations. So I don't agree with everything she probably stands for. I would commend her article to all of our listeners, just because it'll sharpen your own thinking and even understanding of what intersectionality is and where it might have gone off the rails.
All right, let's move on to theme 3. So first, we had said there's a real need. The first theme to keep in mind is there's a real need for us in this moment to have moral clarity about condemning what is evil and being able to call evil, evil. And the second theme is that this conflict has exposed some cracks in current justice theory. So the cracks that this has exposed within American and Western justice theory, especially on the progressive left. And then the third theme is there are some moral and strategic implications of what comes next.
Historic Christian just war theory would say that states are justified in responding to evil committed against them. They are justified in defending their right to exist. And so in this case, a response from Israel, it's justified that Israel would respond to this. That's not the same thing as saying, therefore, they have a blank check and anything they do in response to this is justified. It's just simply saying a response to this is justified. Now, from here, you have to get into questions of like, what kind of response would be just? And then you begin to ask a second set of questions, which is related but slightly different. And it's not only what kind of response would be just, but what kind of response would be wise. And the biblical category of justice says here are the possible approaches. And the biblical category of wisdom asks, what would be the approach that would achieve the best outcome? And that's just true of any kind of decision making. It's not just true about conflict. What's going to be fascinating now to watch is there's going to be a lot of calculations that are going to that are being done right now in terms of what kind of response would be the best kind of response here. And we can even see Israel wrestling with this, and we can see the Western powers, principally America, but also other Western allies. We can see them wrestling with that as well. We're talking on the morning of October 26th. Mm-hmm. And as of today, Israel has not invaded Gaza, although in a ground campaign, although they seem to be positioned to do that if they want to do it. And you can even see there's been some debate, like what's taking so long, and you can see some of these calculations about what would or would not be best starting to happen. And we need to be praying for wisdom, and we need to be praying that the Lord would work this out in a way that the least amount of loss of civilian life and just would happen, and mm-hmm. that conflict could be brought to an end. So we need to be praying along those lines,
mm-hmm. and to do so with an understanding and a sober-mindedness. Not only that this is a moment that's important in regard to what Israel will decide to do. So you said the moral and strategic implications. I think that's an important consideration. It also is important for us to realize the type of political terror organization that Hamas is, and that they themselves may bring about greater loss of Palestinian life. And so there's a nuanced perspective there in praying for this and a potential outcome with minimal loss of human life on both the Palestinian and the Israeli side, and a real possibility for suffering in both of those fronts, of Palestinians, of Israelis. And I think you're absolutely right. God is the only one who can intervene to make this go any different direction.
And there's also a real possibility that this escalates to become something more than an Israel-Palestine conflict. And it has implications for all of us because of the global dimensions that are at play here. There's a writer in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, who writes a lot on Middle East politics, and I find him to be pretty helpful in understanding some of the strategic calculations that have to be made, some of the dangers of pursuing this particular course of action or that particular course of action, and in just explaining the complexity of all the different things that go into the situation there. He wrote an article on October 25th, and he's writing almost every day or every other day on what's happening there. But he wrote an article on October 25th called Israel from the 6-Day War to the Sixth Front War. And he just explained 6 different fronts or dimensions that are all flowing together in how this works itself out. And I thought it helped me understand the complexity that I'm even experiencing as I'm trying to understand this. He mentioned the 6 fronts he mentioned were Israel fighting against Hamas, which is the power there in the Gaza Strip. He talked about Israel fighting against Iran and its proxies. So Iran's influence is huge and works through a lot of proxies. Then he talked about the impact of social media and digital networks on the perception of what is good and what is evil. He in particular mentioned the hospital bombing that happened that appears to have been a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket, and yet through kind of the distortion field of social media and propaganda, it was originally pinned as Israel bombed this hospital in Gaza. He talked about the intellectual and philosophical struggle within the international progressive community between it and Israel, and that's the tension we were just talking about. He talks about the politics inside the Palestinian territories, like Palestinians can't agree among themselves on what the best approach would be. And then he talks about the politics inside Israel, and there's different factions within Israel who don't agree on what the best approach would be. And Netanyahu is on the right of Israel politics, and has generated a lot of discord in his own society up until this point. So Thomas Friedman is explaining how all this is flowing together in a way that like I couldn't ever possibly figure out on my own. And so I find writers like him to be very, very helpful, and would recommend his work.
Mm-hmm. His article is really helpful. You had sent it to me, and I read it in preparation for today's episode, and you listed those 6 fronts. It brings us back to where we started this conversation, that this is really complicated. It is complex, and yet the complexity of the situation shouldn't make us unable to see certain aspects of it clearly. There's some of it that will remain convoluted and will remain complicated. The history, even of the region, the entire thing is mired in this really complicated both history and relationship in the present, and factions within Palestine and factions within Israel. So as we seek understanding, we can understand that it is complex and complicated. We'll continue to read, we'll continue to seek moral clarity.
Mm. The world is becoming more complicated and perhaps more violent. And so this might be the first of several international relations and global politics episodes of Vision for Life. If our listeners like that, let us know. And if they don't like that, let us know as well.
If you don't like that, you can say, could you take these conversations offline? You and Hunter can figure this out on your own time. But we love to hear from those of you listening. If you have questions about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. And if you yourself are reading some articles or books that you find interesting, we want to know. Send those to us too. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.